The frost came early to Ashcroft Park in the January of 1814, settling into the limestone like a patient and ancient thing, pressing its white fingers into every crack and seam until the very walls seemed to exhale cold air from within. The oaks along the eastern drive stood motionless, their bare arms held outward as though offering something they no longer possessed, and the gravel beneath them was silvered and still, undisturbed since the last cart had come through 3 days before the new year turned. The house itself watched the lane with its rows of tall, sashed windows, each pane opaque with frost's delicate etchings. And if Ashcroft Park had a will, and those who worked its corridors believed quietly that it did, it was waiting, as it had been waiting through the long grey months since summer, for something it could not name but recognized none the less as necessary. The gateposts were capped in ice. The fountain in the south courtyard had long since ceased its speaking. Even the rooks in the elm copse beyond the kitchen garden had grown reticent, as though sound itself were a luxury the season would not permit. It was into this stillness that the hired cart arrived just past the 11th hour of a Thursday morning, its single horse blowing great clouds of breath into the cold, its wheels grinding over the frozen gravel with a sound that seemed an impertinence. There was one passenger and one trunk lashed behind, and the passenger sat very straight despite the cold, her dark wool cloak drawn close, her gloved hands folded in her lap, with the deliberate composure of someone who has learned not to betray uncertainty in new places. Her name was Maren Voss. She was 27 years old, the daughter of a Flemish merchant father whose ledgers had always balanced, and an English mother whose voice had carried the soft cadences of Suffolk. She had been orphaned young enough that loss had become a kind of weather she had learned to dress for, and old enough that she remembered, still, what warmth had felt like before it was withdrawn. She carried in her cloak's inner pocket a letter of employment, its seal broken and its creases worn from several readings, which engaged her services as governess to a single unnamed pupil at a wage that was modest but dependable. 2 qualities she had come to value above all others. Mrs. Aldgate met her at the door with the efficiency of a woman who had kept a great house running through harder disruptions than a governess arriving from Hertfordshire. She was stout and capable and not unkind, though her kindness expressed itself in the form of tasks completed rather than words offered, and she led Maren through the entrance hall, where the marble floor was swept clean, but the cold rose through it as though the stone remembered the outside, and up a back stair and along a corridor of closed doors to a room at the corridor's end that smelled faintly of beeswax, and more strongly of disuse. The schoolroom. 2 years, Mrs. Aldgate said, since anyone had sat at those chairs, and she said it without elaboration, in the tone of someone reporting a weather fact, and moved on to the arrangement of the fire grate before Maren could ask what she might have asked. The fire, once it took, was tentative at first and then generous, and in its light the room showed itself to be a good room, high-ceilinged, with a long table and a globe on a stand and a shelf of primers whose spines had faded to gentle colours. Maren set her gloves on the table and looked at the globe and felt the peculiar sensation of a life pausing on its hinge. It was in the quiet that followed, as Mrs. Aldgate's footsteps receded down the corridor, that the sound came, once only, and from a distance, muffled by walls and a locked door somewhere in the wing that lay beyond the green baize door at the corridor's far end. A child's cough, thin and dry as winter paper, and then silence as absolute as before, as though the house had drawn the sound back into itself and sealed it away. No one explained it. Maren did not ask. She stood at the schoolroom window instead and watched the grey light move across the courtyard below, and it was there, just as the light shifted and the afternoon began its early withdrawal, that she saw him. A figure crossing the far courtyard alone, unhurried, his dark coat making him briefly distinct against the pale stone before the angle of the wall took him, and he was gone. A silhouette only, a man of some height, moving as though the cold was simply the condition of things and not a thing to be argued with. She did not know his name yet, not truly, though the letter in her pocket named him Edmund Ashcroft, the Duke. She watched the empty courtyard for a moment longer, and the frost on the window glass traced its quiet patterns between her and the place where he had been, and Ashcroft Park held its breath around her, patient as limestone, patient as January, waiting for what the year would bring. The east wing smelled of cold ash and lavender water. The lavender faded to something more like grief than perfume by the time it reached the narrow corridor where Mrs. Aldgate walked with her ring of keys held close against her hip, as though the keys themselves were creatures that might escape. Maren followed 3 paces behind, her boot heels muffled on a carpet so worn that the pattern beneath had surrendered all claim to colour. The wall sconces had not been lit. Morning light fell sideways through a single window at the corridor's end, and the dust within it moved with the slow, unhurried patience of a house that had long since stopped expecting visitors. Mrs. Aldgate paused before a door that bore no nameplate, only a faint, pale rectangle where one had been removed, the varnish beneath it still bright as a scar. She did not knock. She opened the door with the particular efficiency of a woman who has decided that ceremony costs more than it returns, and she stepped aside to let Maren enter first, which was itself a kind of statement. The room was a schoolroom in the way that an empty bird cage is still a cage, the shape of its purpose preserved, the purpose itself long flown. 2 small chairs stood before a table bare of everything except a candlestick with a cold, half-spent candle. A shelf held books arranged by height rather than subject, as though someone had given up on knowledge and settled for order. The fireplace was dark, the grate clean, the cold in the room so settled and so thorough that it seemed not an absence of warmth, but a presence of its own. A third occupant, waiting to see what the morning would bring. He was standing in the far corner beside the window, and had Maren not been the sort of woman who looked at corners before she looked at centres, she might not have seen him at all. He was thin in the manner of children who have spent too long being quiet, his dark hair pressed flat on one side from sleep, his eyes the particular grey of river water, when the sky above it cannot decide between rain and cloud. He wore a wool jacket too large at the shoulders and too short at the wrists, and he held himself with the stillness of a creature that has learned that stillness is its best protection. Mrs. Aldgate introduced him as the ward. She said the word without ornament and without apology, the way one says the larder or the east passage, a designation for a room, not a name for a person. His surname was not offered. Maren had noticed already in the half-day she had spent within Ashcroft Park that certain words were used with great care by the household as though they were coins of uncertain value. The ward, the arrangement, the late difficulty. She did not ask. Maren crossed to the fireplace and opened the iron box beside it, found tinder and a modest reserve of wood, and set about making a fire with the calm, unhurried competence of someone who has warmed cold rooms before and expects to warm cold rooms again. The boy watched. She could feel his watching without turning to look at it the way one feels a candle burning behind one's shoulder. When the fire took, and the first real warmth moved into the air, she heard his breath shift. Not a sigh, not quite, but a small release, a fraction of held tension relinquished to the room. She drew one of the small chairs closer to the fire and opened her travelling case, which she had carried up herself rather than wait for it to be brought, and from it she took a picture book, one of her own from girlhood, its cloth spine rubbed soft, with handling. She sat down and began to read aloud. She did not address him. She did not gesture toward the second chair. She read of a ship at sea in winter, of a captain's daughter who kept a lantern lit through a long, dark storm, and she read in the unhurried cadence of someone reading for herself, as though the boy's presence were a pleasant coincidence rather than the entire purpose of the exercise. He moved closer by degrees, the way one moves toward a fire when one is not certain one has been invited. First to the table, one hand resting on its edge, then to the second chair, which he did not sit in but stood behind, his fingers on the back of it. Mrs. Aldgate had withdrawn without Maren noticing precisely when. Later, when Maren straightened his narrow bed to set the linen right, her hand brushed something beneath the mattress, a folded paper, thick at the crease, handled so many times that the fold had gone soft as cloth. She withdrew her hand without looking and smoothed the coverlet flat over the place where it lay. Some things a child hides not from wickedness, but from the need to possess one thing that belongs entirely to himself. When she returned to the fireside and turned the page, the boy sat down at last. His shoulders dropped, one careful inch, toward the warmth. The library at Ashcroft Park breathed differently after midnight. The tall windows held nothing but their own darkness, and the single candle on the reading table cast a circle of amber so modest it seemed less like illumination than a confession. Here, it said, is the precise measure of warmth this room will allow. The smell of the place was particular. Cold ash from a grate that had not been tended since the household retired, old leather drawn tight by winter air, and beneath it all the faint mineral patience of paper that had waited years to be read, and expected to wait several more. Maren had come down for nothing more consequential than a glass of water. She had told herself as she descended the servants' stair that she would be 10 minutes, no more, and that the great house would not notice her passage through it. The great house, as it happened, was already occupied. She saw the light beneath the library door before she reached it, a thin gold seam that had no business being there at such an hour, and she paused with her hand raised and her candle guttering in the draught that moved perpetually through the old corridor as though the walls themselves exhaled. She might have retreated. She did not. The door, when she opened it, gave onto a room that seemed to receive her without surprise, as rooms do when they have already accommodated something larger and stranger than a governess in a borrowed shawl. Edmund Ashcroft, Duke of Ashcroft, stood at the far end of the central table with a dispatch unfolded before him, one hand resting flat upon the paper, and the other at his side. He was 34. Maren would not have guessed younger. His face in the candlelight was composed in the manner of a man who has practised composure until it sits upon him like a coat, cut precisely to his measure, comfortable only because he has worn it long enough to forget what ease once felt like beneath it. He looked up. He looked at her. The look was not unkind, but it was cataloguing, the sort of attention a careful man pays to a new object in a room he thought he knew, noting its dimensions and probable weight, before deciding where, if anywhere, it belongs. He said her name, or rather her title, with the faint interrogative of a man confirming information rather than greeting a person. She answered with her own name as she had given it to Mrs. Aldgate, and the silence between them was the silence of two people who understand without discussion that the hour makes ceremony absurd. Above the mantel, a portrait hung in the specific way of portraits that have been looked at too often from too close a distance. The paint worn smooth in the lower quadrant, where a hand might rest against the frame, the gilt tarnished in the places that candlelight reached nightly. The young man in the portrait wore a uniform, and he wore it with the particular ease of the newly commissioned who have not yet learned that a uniform is also a promise. His face shared something with the Duke's, the set of the jaw, the quality of the brow, though where Edmund's expression had long since concluded its argument with feeling, the young man's had not yet begun one. Maren did not ask about the portrait. The Duke asked one question. He asked whether Thomas had slept. The question came clipped and quiet, the words themselves unremarkable, and yet the weight behind them arrived in the room before the words did. The way cold arrives through a window before one thinks to look for the gap. It was not the question of a guardian discharging an obligation, it was the question of a man who has asked it before, in his mind, at other hours, and found it easier to carry if occasionally given voice. She told him the child had slept well, that he had asked for a second candle but had not wept. Edmund received this with a nod so small it was nearly only an intention to nod, and then he folded the dispatch along its existing creases, which spoke of a document handled often, and he set it upon a smaller pile at the far corner of the table. He wished her a good evening, the phrase precise, formal, a door held open and then closed with equal courtesy. He left without lighting a second candle for her, and the room he left behind was not darker for his absence, though it was in some way less weighted, the way a room recovers its neutrality after the departure of grief that has been standing very still and taking up very little space. Maren stood for a moment in the amber circle, alone with the smell of old paper and cold ash, the portrait above the mantel watching the space where he had been. Fever arrived at Ashcroft Park, as it so often does, without announcement, slipping through the nursery door on a draught that smelled of rain-soaked stone and the last of the season's damp leaves. Thomas had been restless since supper, turning against his pillow with the particular agitation of a small body that does not yet understand why it burns. And Maren had stayed, as was her habit, long past the hour when the candles on the corridor sconces had guttered to their collars. The house settled around her in its customary creaking speech, the long case clock on the landing marking each quarter, with a tone that resonated somewhere behind the ribs, the wind pressing its cold shoulder against the casement glass as though curious about the child within. She had drawn his coverlet to his chin twice already, only to find it kicked free again, and so, on the third occasion, she rose with the deliberate quietness of someone who has learned to move through sleeping households as through shallow water, and went to the cedar chest beneath the window in search of the woolen blanket she had seen folded there on the afternoon of her arrival. The chest was deeper than she remembered. She knelt, pressing the lid back against the wall, and reached past a folded length of flannel and what appeared to be a small wooden horse missing one leg, until her fingers met something else entirely, not the blanket, which lay beneath, but a sheet of paper that had slid from some higher resting place and settled against the interior of the chest's front panel. She drew it free, without yet understanding what it was. A letter, she saw at once, folded twice along horizontal creases that had been made and remade so many times that the paper had grown soft along those lines, almost tender, as cloth becomes tender after long laundering. The hand was not elegant. It was the writing of a man more accustomed to action than to correspondence, the letters formed with care, but without ornament, each word pressed firmly into the page as though the writer knew he could not afford to be misunderstood. The direction on the outer fold read, His Grace, the Duke of Ashcroft, and beneath it, with a specificity that arrested her entirely, a date, the 14th of March, 1812, 2 years, then, before this winter, before this child's fever, before her own arrival at this house. She ought not to have read further. She knew it in the instant before she unfolded the sheet, in the way one knows a step is too steep before the foot commits to it. And yet the paper was already open in her hands, and the first line presented itself to her with the calm authority of a fact that has waited long enough to be known. By the time you read this, James is gone, and the boy is yours to keep safe. She read it only the once. She was certain of this afterward. Only the once, those 17 words, and then she folded the letter along its softened creases with the same careful reversals with which it had been closed before, and held it in her lap for a moment that stretched beyond ordinary measurement. The fire had burned low. Thomas shifted against his pillow and made a small sound, not quite a word, and she rose and went to him, pressing the back of her fingers to his temple in the gesture her own mother had used in the years before Maren had grown too old to require it. The fever had not broken, but it had not worsened either. It held its position with the patience of something that intends to pass in its own time. She tucked the blanket she had originally sought. She had found it at last, beneath the letter, as though the letter had been its keeper, around Thomas's narrow shoulders, and then she returned to the chest, and lifted the boy's mattress at its corner, and replaced the folded paper in the space from which it had fallen, and pressed the mattress down again. She did not ask herself what she intended by this. She was not yet equal to the question. Instead, she drew the chair closer to the bed and sat with her hands folded in her lap, the candle burning lower by the hour, and she kept watch over the sleeping child in the way that one keeps watch over something whose full significance has only just begun to make itself felt. The hours between deep night and grey morning passed in that suspended manner particular to sick rooms, where ordinary time seems to pause and consider itself. Thomas slept more quietly after midnight, and by the time the first colourless light began to define the edges of the curtains, his breathing had steadied into the long, even rhythm of proper sleep. Rather than the shallow, rapid cadence of fever, Maren had not slept at all. She was still in the chair, upright, her hands still folded, when she heard the quiet footfall in the corridor. Different from the tread of a housemaid, heavier, more deliberate, slowing as it neared the nursery door. The door did not open fully. It opened only enough to admit the Duke's gaze, and what it found was the boy asleep in the candle's last light, and Maren sitting beside him, her posture unchanged from the hours before. She did not turn at once. When she did, she saw his hand braced against the doorframe, and she saw the expression on his face. Not surprise precisely, but something that moved through surprise and arrived at a quieter shore. Some rearrangement of the features that she had no adequate name for, and that he recovered from, or concealed, before either of them spoke. The east wing smelled of beeswax and cold toast, and the particular stillness that settles over a sick room when fever has finally released its hold. Morning light entered through tall windows in pale, unhurried columns, touching the white cloth of the breakfast table and the small brown teapot and the rim of a cup placed, with some deliberateness, at the head of that table rather than at the long mahogany expanse of the dining room 3 corridors distant. Ashcroft Park itself seemed to notice the change. The house had grown accustomed in its old stone way to the Duke taking his breakfast alone in his study, surrounded by ledgers and the quiet industry of a man who prefers the company of obligation to the uncertainty of other persons. Thomas sat between them, recovered enough for porridge, still pale enough to be wrapped in a wool blanket over his chair, and the small wooden horse rested beside his bowl in the manner of a trusted companion who had endured the long night alongside him. Edmund Ashcroft appeared in the doorway at precisely 8:30, still in his dark morning coat, and paused in a way Maren Voss had not observed him pause before, as though calculating the particular arithmetic of entering a room where another adult was already present, and breakfast already poured. He sat. Maren poured a second cup without being asked, because the teapot was closer to her hand and it seemed the simpler thing, and Edmund received it with a nod that contained, she thought, a fraction more acknowledgement than strict courtesy required. They spoke first of Thomas, as was natural, of the child's appetite returning, of whether the morning air through the window was too sharp, of the reading primer left open on the window seat, and whether Thomas might feel equal to a quarter of an hour of letters that afternoon. Edmund asked whether Thomas had made progress with his letters before the illness, and Maren said that he had mastered the entire first half of the alphabet with very little difficulty, and had shown a particular fondness for the letter G, which he liked to draw large and elaborate, with curlicues that bore no resemblance to any typeface yet invented. Something at the corner of Edmund's mouth shifted. It was not a smile precisely, not yet, but it was the movement of a face remembering that such a thing as a smile had once been available to it. It was Maren's surname that drew the question. He said it carefully, as a man will say a word in a language he recognizes but does not speak fluently, and asked whether it was Flemish in origin. She told him it was, that her father had been a merchant from Bruges, that her mother had been English from a family in Worcestershire, and that both were gone now, her father when she was 19, her mother 2 years after. She offered this plainly, without the performance of grief, and Edmund received it in the same manner, without the performance of sympathy, which was, she found, a considerable relief. He asked whether she still had any Flemish, and she said she did, though it had grown a little rusty for want of use, the way a language will when it has no one to return to. He said that he had read some Flemish correspondence once in relation to a shipping matter, and had found the grammar formidably logical. She said that Flemish grammar rewarded patience and punished haste, and that this made it, in her private opinion, an excellent grammar for a governess to carry in her head. The shipping matter became a small conversation about Bruges and its canals, and the particular quality of winter light on flat water, and for several minutes Ashcroft Park ceased to be a house of closed doors, and became simply a room where 2 people were talking over breakfast about a city that had formed, in different ways and at different distances, the edges of both their lives. It was Thomas who interrupted, pushing the wooden horse across the cloth toward Edmund's cup. Edmund looked at it. He looked at Thomas. He moved the horse back 1 space. Thomas moved it forward 2. Edmund moved it back 1. And then, with a deliberateness that was very nearly solemn, 1 space forward. Thomas considered this. The game had a logic that appeared to be known to Thomas alone, but he accepted Edmund's contribution with a nod of grave approval, and moved the horse to a new position beside the sugar bowl. Maren watched Edmund's hands around his teacup. They had been held, she now saw, with a tension she had mistaken for stillness, a careful steadiness that was not ease but its imitation, maintained over a long time and across a great many empty mornings. And then, between one breath and the next, she watched that tension leave. His hands simply rested. The teacup was a teacup. The wooden horse was a wooden horse. The east wing held the soft sound of a child tapping a small toy against a breakfast table, and the winter morning continued, and nothing was required of anyone except to remain a little longer at that table, in that light. The frost had not yet loosened its hold on the gravel drive when the carriage arrived, its wheels cutting twin dark furrows through the white, as though the house itself were being measured for something it had not yet agreed to. Ashcroft Park received the morning with its customary silence, the tall windows giving nothing away, the elms standing in their bare patience as they had stood through 100 such arrivals, and would stand through 100 more indifferent to consequence, rooted in a knowledge older than the family they had outlasted. The cold pressed close against the stone, settling into the mortar between courses, lying flat along the sills, a frost that did not burn but simply endured as the house itself endured. It was Thomas who saw the carriage first, pressing his small nose to the schoolroom glass with the frank curiosity of a child who has learned that the world beyond the gate is mostly rumour and occasionally real. Maren drew him back gently, opened the primer to the page they had abandoned the day before, and said nothing of what she had seen. The man who stepped down from the carriage moved with the particular economy of someone who has learned that stillness impresses more than ceremony. He wore a coat of dark wool, well cut, but not fashionable, and he carried a leather satchel that sat close against his side, as a man carries a thing he does not intend to set down in any room where he cannot see all the doors. There was something in the set of his shoulders, some practised containment, that suggested a man accustomed to entering houses where he was not precisely welcome and remaining until his business was concluded. His name, the footman announced to the entrance hall with the slight elevation of voice reserved for London visitors, was Mr. Silas Wren, solicitor, come on behalf of certain interests he represented, and he had letters. He had a great many letters. Edmund received him in the long parlour, and the house absorbed the sound of their voices as it absorbed everything, quietly and without comment. Maren came down the east corridor an hour later with Thomas's lesson books pressed to her side, the boy having been sent to practise his letters at the small desk by the window, while she retrieved the volume on natural history they had misplaced the evening before. She did not intend to pass the parlour. The corridor arranged it otherwise, as corridors in old houses sometimes will, offering a half-open door and a carrying quality of stone that the architects had not designed for discretion. Mr. Wren's voice reached her before she reached the door, measured, pleasant, the voice of a man who has spent years making unwelcome things sound entirely reasonable. He was speaking of parentage, of documentation, of the manner in which an unrecognized heir creates, as he phrased it, with a solicitor's careful delicacy, a certain vulnerability for the estate, naturally, and for all parties who had a legitimate interest in clarity. Edmund's reply was brief, and the subject did not continue. But Maren had heard the word vulnerability spoken with that particular softness that men use when they mean something harder, and she stood for a moment in the corridor with the natural history volume cold in her hands, quite still, her breath the only movement in the passage, before she continued on. It was later, when she brought Thomas down to retrieve his carved horse from the entrance hall where he had left it that morning, that she observed Mr. Wren a second time. He stood near the window at the far end of the hall, ostensibly studying the landscape, but his attention shifted the moment Thomas appeared at the top of the stair. It did not shift with the warm, involuntary interest that adults sometimes show toward children, that unguarded softening of the eye. It was something more deliberate than that. Mr. Wren watched the boy descend the stairs with the focused patience of a man who has already made a calculation and is now simply verifying his arithmetic. Thomas, absorbed in recovering his horse, did not notice. Maren noticed. She kept her expression easy and her pace unhurried, and she placed herself, without appearing to do so, between Thomas and the room's far window. Wren smiled at her pleasantly as they passed. She returned the smile with equal pleasantness and thought nothing that showed. The carriage departed before supper, carrying Mr. Wren and his leather satchel back toward London and whatever office waited for him there, and the gravel drive smoothed itself over in the low afternoon light as though the furrows had never been. But the house did not quite settle. Ashcroft Park had stood through 2 centuries of weather and negotiation, and it knew the difference between a visitor who had come and gone and a visitor who had come and noted what he found and gone only in the most immediate and temporary sense. That evening the light in Edmund's study burned past the last bell, and Maren, passing through the corridor above, on her way from Thomas's room, heard the steady, deliberate sound of footsteps crossing the length of the room and returning, crossing and returning, the measured, restless walk of a man who is thinking through something he cannot yet put down. The schoolroom smelled of beeswax and cold plaster that morning, a thin winter light falling across the globe and the primer and the small ink-stained hands of Thomas, who was conjugating Latin verbs with the grave concentration of a boy determined to please. Ashcroft Park had settled into its customary stillness after the solicitor's arrival, the kind of stillness that old houses adopt when they sense a disturbance and choose, for the moment, to absorb it, rather than echo it back. The corridors held their breath, the panelled walls, darkened by decades of coal smoke and candlelight, seemed to lean inward with patient attention, as though they too were keeping something close. It was into this quiet that Silas Wren appeared at the schoolroom door, not dramatically, not with any particular urgency, but with that particular quality of arrival that belongs to men who have made a habit of entering rooms they were not entirely invited to enter. He wished Miss Voss a pleasant morning. He complimented Thomas on his posture. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he hoped to review the East Wing records at some point, household accounts, correspondence logs, whatever small administrative documents had accumulated over the years, purely for completeness, he said, the word landing softly, without apparent weight. Maren looked up from the lesson table with an expression that was perfectly composed and entirely cordial. She explained that the morning hours were kept strictly for Thomas's instruction, and that the afternoon schedule, she feared, was equally full, as they had fallen somewhat behind in arithmetic following the boy's illness, and she was most anxious to restore the ground they had lost. She said all of this with such unaffected pleasantness, such transparent concern for the child's education, that Wren could find no seam in it to press against. He withdrew. Thomas asked, once the footsteps had faded down the corridor, whether the man would return, and Maren told him that some visitors, like certain varieties of English weather, tended to pass more quickly if one simply continued with one's hat on. The boy accepted this and returned to his verbs. That evening, after Thomas had been settled for the night and the candles in the upper corridor had been trimmed to their lowest, Maren went quietly to the room where she had kept the letter these past weeks, tucked beneath the thin mattress of the cot nearest the window. She did not unfold it. She did not read it again. She carried it instead to her own small chamber at the far end of the east wing, where she placed it between the pages of a household register she had been given charge of on her arrival. Her reason, if asked, could not quite have been put into the language of strategy, for it was not strategy that moved her. It was rather the quiet recognition that Thomas, being 6 years old and possessed of a generous and trusting nature, might one day be persuaded to share what he knew with someone who inquired in a kind voice. The letter should not be where Thomas might find it and offer it freely. That was all. She was not acting for herself. She was not acting truly, even for the Duke. She was acting for a child who did not yet know that the world required protecting. Edmund checked beneath the mattress the following morning. He did not know precisely why he checked, only that he had been thinking about the letter since Wren's arrival with a kind of careful, sideways attention, the way one watches a flame in a draught without wishing to appear anxious. The mattress yielded nothing. He stood in the empty schoolroom for a moment, the Flemish verse volume he had been carrying still held loosely in one hand, and he felt something shift in his understanding, not alarm but its gentler cousin, relief, and beneath the relief a quality of regard that he had not named yet and did not press himself to name. He placed the volume on the schoolroom table. He turned back the first page, so that the corner bent with the small, deliberate gesture of a mind that wishes to be understood without speaking. He left without a note, which was its own kind of statement. At supper that evening, Thomas, without preamble and with the disarming directness that belongs exclusively to children and to very old judges, informed the Duke that Miss Maren was keeping the important things safe. Edmund set down his fork. He did not ask what thing, nor where, nor why. He asked Thomas whether he had eaten his soup, and Thomas said he had eaten most of it. Edmund looked then across the table to where Maren sat, not at her hands, not at the distance beyond her shoulder, but at her directly, with the full and settled attention of a man who has just learned something he had not known he needed to learn. The fire shifted in the grate. The house breathed around them steady and unhurried, the way old places do when they have finally recognized who, in the room, is worthy of their keeping. The library at Ashcroft Park held its breath long after the household had gone to sleep, the last log settling into a bed of orange ash with a sound like a sigh drawn slowly inward. Candlelight moved across the spines of leather volumes in slow amber waves, and the cold that pressed against the tall windows was the particular cold of a winter night, so deep it seemed to have forgotten the possibility of any other season. Maren stood at the reading table with her hands at her sides, the folded letter resting where she had placed it, precisely centred on the green baize, a deliberate thing, a thing offered rather than surrendered. She had not heard the Duke come in. That was the quality of Ashcroft Park she had never quite reconciled herself to. Its corridors absorbed sound the way old churches did, swallowing footsteps and sighs and small disturbances of the air, as though the house itself had grown practised at keeping confidences. Edmund Ashcroft stood just inside the door with his coat still on, as a man stands who believed he would only remain a moment and has since forgotten that intention. His eyes went first to the letter, then to her, and what passed across his face was not the hard geometry of accusation she had prepared herself to receive, but something altogether quieter and more difficult to meet, a recognition, she thought, that she had chosen to make this simple when she might have made it very complicated indeed. He crossed the room without speaking. He lifted the letter and held it in both hands, but did not unfold it, and the fire snapped once, sharply, as though marking the pause. When he did speak, his voice was low and unhurried, shaped by a weariness that had nothing theatrical in it, the weariness of a man who has carried a particular weight so long he has ceased to notice the posture it imposes on him. His brother James, he said, had died at Salamanca. Not the Salamanca of dispatches and gazette notices and the clean, heroic grammar of official grief, but the real Salamanca, the mud and the fever tents, and the long weeks after, when the letters stopped and the silence that replaced them was its own kind of answer. James had been 26. He had been, Edmund said, without elaboration, the better of the two of them, which was a thing he appeared to believe with the simple, undefended certainty of long acquaintance. Thomas had been born some months before the battle in a village south of the city to a woman named Elena, who had died of a fever before she could grieve for the father of her son. A Spanish woman, Edmund said, a phrase that carried in his voice neither diminishment nor elaborate correction, only the plain shape of what was true. There had been a midwife, a priest, a certificate of birth with James Ashcroft's name written into it in the firm hand of a man who intended the record to stand. Someone had sent the certificate north. Edmund did not say how it had found its way to England, but it had, and it had found equally its way to the attention of a cousin whose interest in the Ashcroft succession was not, he said quietly, the interest of affection. He had brought Thomas home because there was no other word for what the alternative would have been. To leave the child without protection in the knowledge that the certificate existed was not a thing he had been able to frame as a choice. Ashcroft Park had become then a kind of shelter, dressed as ordinary life. The governess post, the careful vagueness about origins, the volume of Flemish verse left on a table rather than a direct confrontation, all of it was the architecture of a man trying to hold something fragile steady with the ordinary furniture of a household's days. He finished, and the fire breathed, and the cold outside pressed a little closer against the glass. Maren had not moved. She had listened in the way she had learned to listen when she was very young, and the listening itself was a form of loyalty, without interruption, without the small editorial sounds that reframe another person's words into your own understanding before they have completed their own. When the silence had settled enough to speak into, she asked only whether Thomas was safe, whether the boy who had fallen asleep 2 floors above them, with one hand still closed around the carved wooden horse he would not yet surrender to the nursery shelf, was, in this house in some reliable sense, safe. Edmund looked at her. He said that Thomas was safe here as long as no one outside this house knew what the letter contained. It was not a threat, and it was not a plea. It was the honest shape of the situation offered to someone he had, without quite planning to, begun to trust. The candle nearest Maren guttered once in a draught from the old chimney and then steadied, its small flame resuming its quiet, vertical task. Outside, the grounds of Ashcroft Park lay under a thin cloud that softened the moon to a general pale luminescence, and the night was very still. In the library, 2 people stood in a silence that had become, in the space of a few exchanged sentences, something other than the silence of strangers, something closer to the silence of people who have looked at the same difficult thing and agreed, without requiring it said aloud, to stand on the same side of it. The east corridor of Ashcroft Park had a particular quality of cold in the hours before midnight, not the clean cold of an open window, but the settled, accumulated cold of stone that had been absorbing winter for 2 centuries, patient and indifferent to whatever warm and hurrying creatures passed through it. It was into this corridor that Mrs. Aldgate had carried her candle that evening, and it was there that she had found Silas Wren standing at the junction of two passages, quite still, his hand resting upon the wall beside the door that led by a short flight of stairs to the schoolroom. He had offered some explanation, a wrong turning, the unfamiliar geography of a large house, and Mrs. Aldgate, who had managed Ashcroft Park for 19 years and who knew the geography of every corridor as well as she knew the lines of her own palms, had accepted his explanation with the particular courtesy that domestics reserve for those they do not trust. She had escorted him back toward the guest wing, and then, because she was a woman who understood where her loyalties resided, she had come directly to Maren. Maren listened to the account with her hands folded in her lap, her face composed, her attention entirely still. Mrs. Aldgate delivered the facts plainly, without embellishment, and when she had finished, she waited, reading the younger woman's face for what she might find there. What she found was only a quiet, careful steadiness, the expression of someone who had already begun to think. Maren thanked her. She waited until the housekeeper's footsteps had faded entirely before she rose and took her candle into the passage that connected her own room to the schoolroom, and from the schoolroom to the door of Thomas's chamber. The boy was asleep. He lay on his side with one hand open beside his face, fingers curled as a child's fingers curl in sleep, and his breathing was slow and even, entirely undisturbed by the evening's events. The house held him quietly. Maren stood in the doorway for a long moment, long enough for the cold of the passage to find its way through her shawl, and then she drew the door softly closed and returned to her room. She sat at her writing table. She opened her portable writing case, a small thing of worn Morocco leather given to her by her mother, and she took out a single sheet of paper. She wrote 3 sentences. The first established what Mrs. Aldgate had observed and where. The second identified what Wren had been positioned to access had he proceeded. The third noted that Thomas was undisturbed. She did not ask Edmund for anything. She did not speculate about Wren's intentions. She stated only what was known, clearly, in plain sentences, and she signed her name without flourish. She folded the note, sealed it with a wafer, and gave it to the night footman with a message that it was to be placed in his Grace's hand at whatever hour he might still be waking. Then she sat down in the chair by her own cold grate and opened the Flemish verse volume to a page she had already read 3 times, and read it a 4th. Edmund's reply came before the grey light had fully resolved itself into morning. The footman brought it on a small tray, and Maren took it without expression and broke the seal with steady hands. There were 11 words. Stay close to Thomas. I will handle Wren before noon. She read it twice. The handwriting was Edmund's, not the careful, ducal hand of a formal letter, but the quick, compressed script of a man writing in the last hour before sleep, or the first hour before action. 11 words that asked nothing of her except what she had already resolved to give. She folded the note along its original creases. She opened the Flemish volume to the place marked by a ribbon, to the 2 pages she had already read 3 times, and she laid the note between them and closed the book and set it back in its place on the table beside her bed. The house was quiet around her. The cold pressed in at the window glass. Somewhere below, in the long halls of Ashcroft Park, the morning was beginning its slow accumulation, and whatever Edmund had determined to do before noon was already, somewhere, in his mind, decided. The courtyard held its cold, like a secret, the frost lying white and undisturbed across the cobblestones as though the morning itself had drawn a clean sheet over whatever warmth the house once knew. Ashcroft Park stood very still in that hour before noon, its windows catching the pewter sky and giving nothing back, and the bare elms along the east wall creaked once, and then were silent, as if they too understood that what was about to pass required witnesses of patience rather than noise. It was into this quiet that Edmund Ashcroft descended the broad stone steps, his greatcoat settled about him, with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has already decided everything that need be decided, carrying no papers, wearing no expression that could be read from a distance. Behind him, at a respectful remove of 3 paces, came Mrs. Aldgate, her grey wool shawl drawn close, her hands folded before her, with the particular stillness of a woman who knows she has been asked to remember precisely what she sees. Silas Wren stood beside the hired carriage at the far end of the courtyard, his black coat insufficient against the morning, one gloved hand resting on the carriage door, as though he had already half decided the interview would go in his favour. He was a thin man, made thinner by the cold and by some interior expectation of advantage, and when Edmund approached across the frost, without hurrying, Wren's chin lifted, in the manner of a man arranging a display of confidence he does not entirely possess. Edmund stopped at a distance that required no raising of the voice. He spoke quietly, and with a formality so complete it left no seam through which argument might enter, informing Wren that his engagement with Ashcroft Park was concluded as of that morning, that the grounds of dismissal were breach of household trust, that Mrs. Aldgate stood present as witness to the termination and would attest to its terms if ever the occasion required it. Mrs. Aldgate's eyes did not move from the middle distance, but her chin dipped once, the smallest possible confirmation, and the frost around her feet seemed to harden a degree further. Wren's breath came out in a white plume. He said what men of his particular ambition always say when legal leverage fails them directly, that certain suspicions regarding the ward's parentage might find a sympathetic ear in London, that a cousin with an interest in the estate's succession would perhaps wish to know what a thorough man of business had observed during his time at the park. He did not raise his voice. He said it the way a man sets down a card he believes to be of higher value than any yet played. Edmund regarded him for a moment in the way that frost regards whatever passes over it, with complete indifference and perfect memory. Then he said, with the same unhurried calm with which he had crossed the courtyard, that the matter of guardianship had been attended to through other offices. A deed naming Thomas as his ward in perpetuity had already been filed under English law, properly witnessed and registered, and no suspicion, however energetically conveyed to whomever in London, could alter what the law had settled. As for the letter that Wren's search of the schoolroom had been, Edmund supposed, intended to recover, it was properly accounted for and in safe keeping, and constituted no foothold for anyone. He said it once, without emphasis, and did not say it again. The courtyard was very quiet. The elms offered nothing. Wren's gloved hand tightened briefly on the carriage door, and then his whole figure seemed to make a small, reluctant accommodation to the shape of the morning, as a man does when he understands that the ground he stood upon was never so solid as he imagined. He said nothing further that was worth recording. He climbed into the carriage, and the driver, who had been watching the frost on his boots with great attention, released the brake and turned the horses toward the iron gate at the courtyard's end. Edmund did not watch it go. He turned and walked back across the cobblestones, and Mrs. Aldgate fell into step beside him at the same 3 paces, and neither of them spoke until they had reached the steps. Above them, in the east wing schoolroom window, two shapes stood in the pale rectangle of glass. The slight, attentive figure of Maren Voss, and beside her, smaller and very still, a boy of 6, whose breath had made a small cloud on the cold pane. Thomas asked, in a voice that carried the careful quietness of a child who has learned to ask important things gently, whether the thin man was gone for good. Maren looked down at him. The frost on the courtyard below caught what thin light the sky was offering, and the hired carriage had already passed beyond the gate and out of sight among the bare winter trees, and the estate settled around them all with the deep, unhurried patience of a house that has decided, at last, what it intends to keep. The fire in the library had burned low by the time Edmund Ashcroft drew the deed from its leather folio and smoothed its pages against the desk with the flat of his palm, and the room itself seemed to lean inward at that gesture, the old oak panelling holding its breath as winter pressed its grey cheek against the tall windows, and the smell of beeswax candles and cold parchment mingled in the still air. Thomas sat on the edge of the leather chair, opposite, his feet not quite reaching the floor, his hands folded in his lap with the peculiar solemnity that children adopt when they understand that something of weight is being conducted in their presence, even if the full measure of that weight lies beyond their reckoning. The wooden horse stood on the corner of the desk between them, patient and paint-worn, as it had stood through many silences in that house. Edmund did not begin immediately. He looked at the child for a moment, and in his expression there was something that had not been there in the autumn months. Not warmth precisely, for warmth implies a thing newly kindled, and this was quieter than that, more like a lamp that has been trimmed after long neglect, and now burns steadier than before. He read the relevant clause aloud, not in the clipped cadence of legal recitation, but slowly, as one reads to a person for whom the words must land whole and without confusion, translating as he went into the plain English of a man who has decided that a child of 6 deserves clarity above ceremony. "You belong here," he said, setting the paper down, "and I am responsible for you, by law and by choice." Thomas received this in silence for the length of several heartbeats, his dark eyes fixed on the Duke's face with an attention that was almost fierce in its stillness, as though he were listening not only to the words but to everything beneath them. Then, in the careful voice he used when he was feeling his way towards something important, he asked whether that meant he would not be sent away. Edmund did not look away. He said no, not ever. The word ever fell into the room like a stone into deep water, and the ripples of it moved outward through the air, without ceasing. Thomas nodded once with the gravity of a person who has received an answer they had long needed and did not wish to diminish by excessive response, and then he slid down from the chair with the quiet efficiency of small children everywhere, and crossed to the desk, and moved the wooden horse 1 square forward across the worn leather surface. Edmund watched him. Then, after a pause that held within it something that might have been the beginning of a smile, he reached out and moved the horse back. Thomas moved it forward again. Edmund moved it back. And so they continued for a little while, neither of them speaking, the game proceeding in its own unhurried time, and the fire settled in the grate with a sound like a long breath released. Maren stood at the window. She had not meant to stay so long. She had come only to return a book to its shelf on the far wall, but her feet had ceased to carry her anywhere when Edmund had begun to read, and now she remained where she was, her fingers resting lightly on the window's stone embrasure, the cold of it seeping through the fabric of her sleeve. Outside, The grounds of Ashcroft Park lay under the particular stillness of a December afternoon when the light is already thinking about leaving. The bare limes along the drive, standing in their rows like patient witnesses, frost whitening the grass beneath them. She had looked at this house for months and seen only what it carried, the weight of unspoken things, the rooms that had been closed, and the subjects that had not been raised, the way grief, when it goes long without tending, shapes itself around absence, until the absence becomes the architecture. Now she looked at the two figures at the desk, the man and the boy, and the small wooden horse moving between them, and she understood that what she was watching was not an ending, but a kind of beginning, grief-finding. Slowly and without announcement, the form it might inhabit when it had finished being only grief. She did not hear Edmund look up, for looking makes no sound, but she felt it. And when she turned her gaze from the grounds to the room, she found his eyes already on her, steady and without hurry, and for a moment neither short nor long enough to require accounting for, neither of them looked away. The kitchen garden lay under a hush that only winter knows how to keep. The box hedges silvered along their upper edges, the espaliered pear trees pressed flat against the stone wall like figures in a frieze, and the gravel paths between the raised beds hard as slate, beneath a frost that had not lifted since before dawn. The soil in the raised beds had drawn itself tight and pale, the way earth does when it has been relinquishing warmth for many days together, and the bare stems of the dormant herbs stood in their rows with a kind of spare dignity, neither asking nor offering anything. Ashcroft Park itself seemed to hold its breath. The great house stood at the garden's back, its windows pale and unreflective in the grey afternoon light, and the cold moved across the open ground in slow, deliberate waves, the way cold does when it has decided to stay. It was into this stillness that the Duke of Ashcroft stepped first, leaving the door to the passage ajar behind him, and then turned and waited for Maren Voss to follow. Thomas was asleep. She had settled him herself, his small hand loosening its grip on the coverlet as his breathing deepened, and she had stood a moment at the threshold of the nursery before descending. Edmund had said only that the air would do them good, and she had not questioned this because it was not the air he meant, and they both understood it. He had never before sought her company when Thomas was not the occasion for it. She noticed this. She noticed everything, and had done since the second morning, though she had not permitted herself to name what she noticed as anything other than professional attentiveness. The path between the dormant herb beds was narrow enough that they walked in single file at first, the gravel pressing out its small compressed notes beneath their boots. And then the path widened near the cold frames, and they fell into step beside one another, their breath coming in slow, white ribbons that the stillness erased almost at once. The cold against her cheeks was clean and impartial, and the smell of the frozen ground was the smell of things held in suspension, not absent, merely waiting. Edmund spoke without preamble, as men do when they have already rehearsed a thing too many times and have grown impatient with ceremony. He said that he had observed her from the second morning, not as a governess. He said the word governess with a slight pause before it, as if to indicate that he was setting the category aside entirely. He said he had observed her as a person of uncommon steadiness, and that he had not known what to do with this observation, which was why he had done nothing with it for rather longer than he should have. He said he had watched her guard Thomas, not in the way one guards a charge in order to fulfill an obligation, but in the way one guards something whose worth one has independently assessed and confirmed. He said he found this extraordinary. He said the word extraordinary quietly, without ornament, as though it were simply a precise measurement. Maren walked beside him and did not interrupt. The frost-rimed soil of the raised beds exhaled nothing. The kitchen garden offered no distraction and no softening. She listened to him with the same quality of attention she gave to everything, which was the quality he had been trying to describe. And she understood that he was also describing her to herself, and that he was doing so with accuracy. When he finished, she was quiet for a step or two, the gravel making its small, compressed sounds beneath their boots. Then she said that she had stayed not only for Thomas. She did not elaborate on this. She did not look away. The statement sat between them in the cold air, plain and unhurried, and Edmund turned his head to look at her as she said it, and did not look away either. There was a quality to the silence that followed, which the old pear trees and the stone wall and the frost understood better than language did, a quality of two people standing on the same ground for the first time, having approached it from different directions and arrived together without announcement. They remained near the cold frames for some time, not speaking, looking out over the geometry of the dormant garden, and the cold moved around them both without distinction, laying the same still air across his shoulders and hers. When they turned at last and began the slow walk back toward the house, the distance between them was different. Not smaller precisely. The correct word is not a measure of inches. It was simply different in its nature, the way distance between two people changes when it has been named and accepted, rather than maintained as a form of protection. The house received them at the passage door, and the warmth of the interior closed over them gently, and the kitchen garden lay behind them in its frost, holding the afternoon in the way old gardens hold everything, with patience and without judgment, and for as long as it is asked. The frost that held Ashcroft Park in its long keeping has begun, at last, to release its grip. Along the stone sill of the library window, where January had laid its white seal and February had kept it, a slow bead of water traces a line downward through the morning light, unhurried, certain, as though the house itself has decided to unclench. The east wing, which stood cold and unattended through the darkest weeks, now holds a fire kept through the night, and the warmth has crept into the plaster work, into the wainscoting, into the particular silence that corridors carry when they have not been used. That silence is gone. In its place, drifting upward from the passage beyond the green baize door, comes the sound of a child's laughter. Thomas, 6 years old and entirely confident that the house belongs to him now, which in every way that matters, it does. The deed of guardianship rests in the estate's strongbox, alongside the soldier's letter that first set everything in motion. Neither document is hidden. They are simply kept, as one keeps the instruments of a thing properly concluded, filed away, not in shame, but in the ordinary dignity of settled fact. The solicitor has not returned. The household has heard nothing further from the quarter that once made its quiet threats, and the staff, who understand a great deal more than they are ever asked, have gone about their work with a steadiness that speaks of relief. The announcement was made without ceremony, which was entirely as both Edmund and Maren wished it. He told the housekeeper on a Tuesday morning in the entry hall in the same tone he might use to relay a matter of the household accounts, and the housekeeper received the news in the same spirit, with a composure that did not quite conceal the warmth behind it. There was no assembly of servants, no prepared address, no formal occasion of any kind. By evening, everyone knew. By the following morning the thing had settled into the texture of ordinary life, which is precisely where Maren had always hoped it might one day rest. Thomas was told separately, and with more care. Edmund sat beside him in the schoolroom with the afternoon light lying across the floor between them, and explained in plain language what had been decided, and asked the boy what he thought he might like to call her. Thomas considered the question with the grave thoroughness he brought to all matters he judged worthy of serious thought. He had called her Maren since the early weeks of winter, when the formality of her station had already begun to feel beside the point to him. He considered, and he said, Maren. She was standing in the doorway and heard it, and told him that was exactly right, and meant it entirely. The letter from James, that careful, soldierly hand, writing out the terms of a trust from a campaign camp in 1812, had asked only that the child be placed with someone good. It asked nothing of the woman who might one day stand in a library watching frost melt from the stone with a man beside her who had learned, through grief and guardedness and the slow work of a difficult winter, to say plainly what she was to him. The house breathes around them now. The library smells of the fire Edmund lit before she came downstairs, and of the particular cold and binding glue scent of old volumes that has been there since long before either of them arrived. The window glass holds the pale suffusion of a March morning, not warm yet, not truly, but light in a way that January never was, carrying the first faint suggestion of what is coming. Maren watches the last of the frost release its hold on the stone and slip away. Beside her, Edmund says nothing, which is itself a kind of speech between people who have learned to be quiet together, without the silence costing them anything. Somewhere below, Thomas laughs again at something, perhaps the dog, perhaps the kitchen maid, perhaps simply the fact of being 6 and unworried on a Tuesday in March. The east wing fire burns on. The house holds its breath no longer.